All right, for today's lesson, we're going to do part 2 of key features of functions. So extrema are the points in which the value of the function is at the highest or the lowest point. Now, when we talk about the highest point and the lowest point, graphically, we're looking at what we call the maximum or minimum. So when we talk about a maximum, the maximum is the highest, a local maximum or local minimum is the highest or lowest point within a small interval. Now, you can have more than one maximum, you can have more than one minimum, but a local maximum or minimum occurs when it's not exactly the highest point, but it is a hill or a valley. So when I think about a maximum is going to look like a hill, a minimum is going to look like a valley. So the maximum is at the top of the hill, the minimum is at the bottom of the valley. So when we have an absolute maximum or an absolute minimum, when I think about that, I think the key phrase, it is absolutely the highest or lowest point on the graph. There's nothing that goes below it or there's nothing that goes above it. So an example of this, if I were to think about a graph, so if I have my graph here, I could have a lot of stuff going on, but this is absolutely the highest point on the graph. So that is an absolute maximum. Now, I have another maximum right here because it's got that hill effect. That is going to be a local maximum. It's still a maximum, but it's not the highest point of the whole graph. Just like right here, we have a local minimum. That's a local minimum because it's a valley. It's got that curvature from increasing and decreasing, but it's not the lowest point. And I know it's not the lowest point because I have two arrows continuing that are going down forever. So it doesn't have a maximum, absolute minimum. All right, so another key feature that we're going to talk, or two sets of key features, is increasing and decreasing. So increasing is when you're reading a graph from left to right, the direction it travels is upward. So when you're talking about increasing, when you read the graph from left to right, it's going to travel upward. Decreasing is when you read the graph from left to right and it's going to travel downward. And then we have positive and negative. So positive is when the graph is above the x-axis and it has y values that are positive. So when I'm looking at a graph, I'm looking at all of the parts of the graph that are above the x-axis. And then for negative, when the graph is below the x-axis, that's when all the y values are negative. So we're going to look at several examples and we're going to identify these key features based off of these definitions. So when I look at number 1, I have a lot going on in this graph, but we're going to talk about our maximums and our minimums first. So remember, a maximum is when it's going to change direction. So if it was going up and then it changes to going back down, or if it is, so like if we're looking at this graph, it's going up and then it goes back down. That is a maximum right there. It doesn't have to necessarily be a curve. It could be a straight line, but it still has to change from like increasing to decreasing. So when I look at this graph, I can see that I have a maximum point here, here, and here. So my absolute maximum in this graph is located at 0, 3. Because that graph is not going to go any higher than at 0, 3. Then I have a local maximum. My local maximum is going to be located at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So negative 6, 1. And there's another local maximum located at 4, 1. Okay. So then we're going to talk about our minimum. So we have a minimum here and we have a minimum here. So their absolute minimum. We don't have an absolute minimum in this graph. The graph is going to continue to go downward And that means that the graph is not going to have a minimum, an absolute minimum value, because as it keeps going down, that value is going to continue to get smaller. We do have local minimums, and I have one located at -3, -2, and I have one located at 2, 0. All right. Now, increasing and decreasing, I like to take my pencil and I like to trace my graph and see what direction is happening here. So I'm going to highlight throughout this entire piece here. So I'm going to highlight increasing in pink, and I'm going to highlight decreasing in yellow. So from the left, we're increasing, and then we stop at a maximum and we start to decrease. All right, then we get to a minimum and we're going to increase again. We get to a maximum and it changes, we're going to decrease. So then we're going to get to that minimum again, go to that maximum, and then finally we are decreasing again. So we have multiple intervals of change here. So increasing. When we talk about increasing, we talk about intervals of increasing. So it started to increase coming from the left, and we're going to use our x value. So it stopped increasing right here at this x value of -6. So we were increasing from -infinity to -6. We're talking about this interval right here. So -infinity to -6. So then from -6, so this next interval to -3, we were decreasing. So -6 to -3, we started to decrease here. Finally, again, we have another interval of increasing, and that other interval of increasing is going to be from -3 to 0. And then another interval of decreasing, which is going to be from 0 to 2. Again, we're using x values because when we talk about intervals, we're talking about domain x values. Increasing again from 2 to 4. And then finally, we're going to decrease again, and we're going to keep decreasing to positive infinity. So when you do your intervals, make sure that you are doing your intervals based off of the domain x values. All right, so then we have positive and negative. Now I'm going to erase what we have here because positive and negative really is looking at above the x-axis and below the x-axis. So above the x-axis, I'm going to do in green here. So this is the areas that are above the x-axis, and then we have the areas that are below the x-axis, which I put in blue. So we're looking at those intervals that are positive and those intervals that are negative. So I'm going to start from the left. So I am negative from -infinity to -6. Because we're looking at the x-axis right here, so we're stopping here. And then we're positive from -6 to -5. And then from -5 all the way to, it looks to about, we'll say -1.5. We're negative again. And then we're going to go above the x-axis from -1.5 till 2. And then we're from 2, well, actually, no, let me back up and re-say that again. We actually are going to stay above the x-axis from -1.5, and we stay above the x-axis until we get to +5. So -1.5 to +5. And then finally we go to the negative side again, below the x-axis, from 5 to positive infinity. Okay, so increasing and decreasing are based off of the values of the maximum minimums, the x values, and then positive and negative are based off the x-intercepts of where it goes above the x-axis, where it goes below the x-axis. All right, so looking at example 2, I would recommend putting this in Desmos, which is exactly what I did, and I took a screenshot here and got our values. So we have a lot going on in this graph, okay? So the first thing that they're asking us for are our maximums and our minimums. So I'm going to look for maximums. So I have a maximum here, And that's honestly the only maximum I have. Now that is going to be a local maximum. And the reason that is a local maximum is because this graph is going to continue to keep going. So that's not going to change to make it absolute. We're not going to have an absolute maximum because it's going to keep going to infinity. So we do not have an absolute maximum. We do have a local maximum at negative 1.082 and 8.183. Now, whenever they ask you for a maximum value or they ask you for a minimum value, they're basically asking you to identify the y value of the coordinate. They're asking you how high or how low is it going, okay? So just keep that in mind. So then they want a minimum. So when we look at the minimum, we have a minimum here, and that's all the minimums we have. That graph is going to keep going down. So again, we do not have an absolute minimum, but we do have a local minimum at 2.107 and negative 28.672. All right, so then we have increasing, decreasing, positive, and negative. So I'm going to highlight again from our values. So we'll do blue is increasing this time. So I'm going to be I'm going to be increasing, increasing, increasing. I'm going to keep increasing until I reach that point. And then I'm going to decrease, decrease, decrease until I reach that other minimum. And then I'm going to increase again. All right, so remember we're doing these based off of the x values. So when I look at my graph, I stop increasing at the x value of negative 1.802. So we're increasing from negative infinity to negative 1.802. And then we're going to decrease from negative 1.082. And we're going to decrease to this x value, which is 2.107. And then we're going to change and we're going to start increasing again from at 2.107 to positive infinity. All right, and then we have positive and negative. So remember, positive and negative is just what's above the x-axis and what is below the x-axis. So when I'm looking above the x-axis, I'm going to start from the left, and I can see that I'm below the x-axis. So I'm below the x-axis, which means I'm negative from negative infinity to negative 1.543, because that's that x-intercept right there. Then we're going to be positive, positive until we reach this point, and that's going to be from negative 1.543 to 0.882. And yes, sometimes you're going to have to work with these crazy numbers. We're going to be negative again all the way to the next interval, the next x-intercept. So that's going to be the 0.882, and my next intercept is going to be 2.641. And then we'll remain positive as we go above the x-axis, and we're going to remain positive until infinity. All right. So I'm going to do one more example, and if you need me to, if you need additional help, just let me know, and I'll be more than happy to send you another video of this other example. I just don't want the video to get too long. All right, so again, we have maximums and we have minimums. So I have a maximum here and here. So that's going to give me an absolute maximum because it's absolutely the highest point of the whole graph. And that's going to be located at negative 1.171 and 7.888. We have a local maximum at 0.797 and 1.78. All right, then we have one minimum, and that one minimum is located at 0, 0. That minimum is a local minimum because it's not the lowest point, because I have these pieces that are going to keep going down. So my absolute max minimum, there is not one. All right, so now we're going to do increasing and decreasing. So we're increasing we're increasing from the left, and we're going to keep increasing until we reach that maximum. So that maximum that we're reaching is an x value. Remember, we have that interval there. So that's going to give me negative infinity to negative 171. Then we're going to decrease from that maximum to that minimum, and that's going to be from negative 1.171 until 0, increasing again from 0 to the next maximum, which is 0.797, and then we're going to decrease once again, and we're going to decrease to infinity on that one. So we're going to decrease from 0.797 to infinity. Again, always using the x values that coordinate with those points. All right, and then we're going to do maximum and minimums. Not maximum and minimums, we're going to do positive and negatives. So I start from the negative because it's below the x-axis, and it's negative from negative infinity until that value, that x-intercept, which is negative 1.515. Then we're going to go above the x-axis, and we're going to stay above the x-axis for quite a while for this entire piece, all the way till 1.083. So we have negative 1.515, and we're going to stay positive until 1.083. And then we'll wind up going below the x-axis again, which is going to make it negative until positive infinity. So the only time that you really use the y values when you're defining something is when you're talking about the maximum minimums. When you're doing increasing and decreasing, you're talking about the interval, which is going to be the x value. And positive and negatives, you're also going to be talking about your intervals, which are going to be your x values.